Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today, moderating this panel with you. We've got a great panel today, a wonderful group of people. We're going to get some really interesting perspectives here. Encourage everyone in the audience, though, to put some questions out in the chat. We would love to take some of your questions as well as covering some of the ones that we put together for this event. So I'll start by giving a very quick intro to our panel, and then we'll jump right into it. Today, we have Matt McNeil with us, Director of Standards and Technology, the CIO of Strategy Council. Mayank Mishra, Managing Director, Global Head of Digital Channels from Citi. Rami Tibet, Vice President of Digital Product with the Royal Bank of Canada. Saba Sharif, Head of New Products Developments and Corporate Strategy with Symcor. Stéphane Bousquet, Open Banking Leader, National Bank of Canada. Elizabeth Sal, Partner, Banking and Financial Services with Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. So I'm going to start with you today, Matt. You'll kick us off. I wanted to, first of all, just get some perspectives on the latest developments in the market and how that's influencing the development of open banking or consumer-directed finance.
Great. Thanks so much, Jennifer, and hello, everybody. Happy to be here today and looking forward to getting into some fisticuffs with my colleagues here on the call. I think it should be some interesting conversations for sure. But yeah, lots going on. 2021, as we all know, was a really big year for open banking here in Canada, and lots of developments in the space. So I think it just makes sense to start off with probably the biggest item on the list that came out, which was the Finance Canada consultation. So that committee issued its final report and kind of outlined a path forward for us here in Canada to move towards this. From a personal level, given that our group is tasked with being a neutral party to codify some of this stuff in terms of national standards of Canada, it was we found it very helpful. But I think just outlining the three pillars and the ground rules to go forward and basically just the decision of a hybrid model is something that's going to be best. I mean, we have lots we can learn from our colleagues who have already implemented it in various other countries, including the UK and Australia. But really just, the three pillars of, a common rules, so just to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page and it's a level playing field. Accreditation frameworks, when you get into this sort of thing, it's not only important to follow a framework, but you have to understand how that framework is going to be assessed and make sure that it's all done in the same way. And then it offers obviously these various technical specifications. There's not going to be a one solution fits all for this. There's going to be several specifications that will have to come out to kind of support this and make sure that we have the guardrails and tools for organizations to be successful in this market. So then, we have the report from Finance Canada, and that was great. We then saw the federal government kind of, acknowledge and support this, which was again, fantastic and really get things moving the needle on this. And then lastly, obviously our neighbors to the south in the U.S., they have a big play in our economy as well, and to see that executive order come down, kind of supported everything that was going up here in the Great White North. So lots of great developments. And I think wrapping up this year, 2022 is going to be even more exciting. So
I think that's right. I think, people have felt like things have moved slowly, but I think things will be a little bit different in 2022 on this particular topic. So I'd like to go to Mayank next, just to get some perspectives from your organization and what are some of the initiatives that are going on both in Canada and the US right now that are impacting open banking.
Thank you, Jennifer, and hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here again. So, look, I think at Citi, we consider open banking as a strategic initiative, a key priority. And, when we look at, my role is global. So when we look at the markets, we look at from both the lenses, markets that are regulated from open banking perspective, markets such as UK, Europe, and more recently Brazil in 2020, and markets that are not regulated, markets such as Canada, US, and China, right? So I think, from an organization perspective, there are streams of investments that need to go in to make sure that the technology is upgraded, stuff around APIs, microservices, cloud, and more importantly, consent management, because I think entitlements is going to be an important piece. So from Citi's perspective, what we recognize is, because we are in the space of providing global capabilities, we recognize that we need to have a single platform for our clients to do open banking regardless of where the geography is, right? So that's one of our key initiative. Our brand for that is called Citi Connect APIs. That's live across about 90 markets, right? So, and we see this as a key opportunity from the perspective of market gap and really making life better for the consumer. So we are acting as a third party provider in many cases where we help our customers look at their overall positions across multiple banks, right? And we're working with some fintech companies to make sure that we provide connectivity. We get the connectivity from various banks. So I would say that as instant payments become more of a reality across multiple markets, whether it's B2 and multiple constructs, B2C, C2B, B2B, etc., and people are looking to make more real-time decisions, I think open banking has a significant role to play. But I think the investment in technology is the foundation.
Yeah, that's so critical. Obviously, has to be a priority. I don't know if we have others on the panel who might want to jump in on this particular question about some initiatives they have going on in their organization. Maybe Rami or Stefan?
Well, I think one initiative which isn't FI specific, but that should be noted in here, and stating the obvious here a bit, but it's all the good work that's currently being done within FDX and FDX Canada. So I see this as a very, very positive development, seeing all the major financial institutions across Canada collaborating with peers across the border, collaborating with fintechs as well to see a common standard, a common technical framework being stood up. So I think that one is important to put out there. Absolutely.
Yeah, to
Yeah,
add to
absolutely.
Stefan's point,
Go ahead.
I would say, yeah, sorry about that. To add to Stefan's point, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of getting started and learning from other geographies. One of the things we have noticed is the dialogue and the breadth and depth and understanding of the dialogue around consent management, privacy, and security, and protecting the security of Canadians is definitely much more evolved than we've seen the dialogue emerge in other geographies at the outset of consumer-directed finance in the places like the UK. So I think we're, as an industry, we're all stepping into this in terms of a north star of how to do what's right by Canadians, do what's right for Canadians while protecting them in a geography where we had a very good history collectively as an industry of doing right by the totality of Canada, both businesses and consumers.
Yeah, I think that's right. We certainly don't want to lose that as we move forward with open banking and consumer directed finance. And that actually leads me to my next question for Elizabeth. As we think of how interconnected a lot of these different developments are, the retail payments activities, the FDX that was mentioned, which one of these initiatives do you think is going to have the greatest impact, or these initiatives will have the greatest impact on open banking?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. So it's really interesting when I saw the list of just initiatives that are going on, and they do include things in payments, they do include things like FDX. Some of those are industry driven and some of them are legal and regulatory. And so when I was thinking through, one of the key differences that I see coming at it from a legal perspective is certainly the difference between getting the plumbing of open banking together and then figuring out the utility of open banking. So when I look at some of these initiatives like, consistent payment standards, the payment modernization initiatives, the introduction and the development of the Retail Payment Activities Act, those are great initiatives. They will make open banking useful, which is of course important because we want it to be useful in terms of getting adoption. But in terms of what is actually going to make it happen, those are the things like FDX. Those are the things like figuring out common standards. They're also the things like privacy. And so, we do have privacy reform on the horizon. Bill C-11 died before the election, but it did have a very critical component. And frankly, it was the first time that I'd seen an actual legislated move towards open banking, because C11 contained a data mobility right. And that was when I saw that, the first thing that popped into my mind was open banking. And sure enough, when I was talking with our privacy team at Osler, they were engaged in discussions with government, and open banking was to be one of the first use cases for this data mobility right. Um, of course, it died, as I said, but we know that privacy reform is still on the horizon. It hasn't gone away. We don't know if it's just going to be simply a reintroduction of Bill C11, although there certainly were some aspects of that needed discussion. So maybe it's going to come back in a different form. But that's really how I see it, kind of breaking down that distinction between, what I think of a core open banking from a legal and regulatory perspective, and what would advance it are things like, agreement on the standards, agreement on APIs, agreement on security, agreement on liability. And the final report did talk a little bit about the liability and where that flows with the data. And I think data is, of course, really central. Something like payments initiative and opening up our payments framework to more players, which we're seeing right now. And with the RPAA, the hint that we're going to have now accredited payment service providers who may be able to participate alongside banking institutions in our payments framework is that can be a huge explosion, I think, for the industry, and that will drive people say, "Hey, open banking, this is cool, this is useful to me."
Any key barriers that you see in sort of near term from a regulatory perspective or policy perspective?
I think the barrier right now is really that there isn't anything in the same way that we've had and seen in the UK and Australia, where there's been a mandated open banking, and there's a lot of reasons for that in Canada. Some of the concerns that were present in the UK and Australia aren't really live issues in Canada in the same way. The advisory committee tried to make the villain screen scraping to try to put a little bit more urgency into the situation. I don't know how that is, how that will play out. But certainly we don't have the same sort of, like directives from our competition bureau, things like that. So I think those are the things that are, Canada is looking at from a legal and regulatory perspective. I do think though that, law always lags behind. So we just always see that. And industry, I think, is surging ahead. So we're certainly aware of lots going on in this space, but I don't think we're seeing a, top-down government, UK type thing happening right at this moment in time in Canada. Maybe there'll be some catch up on that point. But by then industry will have leapfrogged ahead again. So I think that's kind of a common pattern we frankly see in Canada. Many white papers, maybe not a lot of concrete actual legislative reform.
That's right. So Elizabeth touched on the payments infrastructure. So maybe I'll go to that next to Rami to talk a bit about, how ready is our digital and payments infrastructure ready right now for this?
Yeah, so you think Elizabeth queued this up with a perfect segue there, and for me. So thank you for that. One of the things I think I would reflect on, you mentioned two things that are incredibly critical, Elizabeth, which is utility, and it has to be utilitarian for the average Canadian, and there has to be value. And I think the narrative has to date been really anchored against two polar extremes, which is pace versus scale and utility and value to Canadians. And we shouldn't be shy from really crafting a made in Canada path, because our point of departure is fundamentally different. Again, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, our point of departure is incredibly different to external geographies. We've had long history of really making it work in our specific manner. How I anchor on this question is really open banking at scale requires coordination. It requires large-scale coordination across the industry, which really leans into some of our strong suits in Canada, FedProv, cooperation, and things that get activated cross-sectorially. It may be a little bit more paced activity, thus speed is a different imperative, but I think we gain larger outcomes. And with these bold plans that we have established, we require the foresight on how we can activate implementation, practical implementation on the ground, that industry and the public sector can move forward on safely and distinctly for Canadians. And key enablement activities for me are things like infrastructure around consent, infrastructure around privacy, infrastructure around security, and the protection of Canadians, really making digitization safe for Canadians, getting Canadians to the place of understanding they don't read back their two-factor codes to a hacker or a scammer. These are fundamental prerequisites in the country for us to step into this in a safe and proper manner. I would say our infrastructure is on the right path. We are making some incredible investments across the country, whether that be in the data space or in the payment space. We still have a lot more to come and a lot more to go to really set the foundation for this. But I do believe that there is a pathway here that both industry and the public sector can engage on productively.
Thanks, Jeremy. That actually, there's a question that came in the chat here that I'm going to throw out to the group right now because it relates to what we've been talking about and what Bill Morneau was speaking about in his speech. His view was that this should be industry led, as we're seeing already in Canada happen, but with the appropriate government oversight. So, does everyone agree with that? That's the question from the audience. Anyone want to start us off on that one?
Well, I'm off
Sure.
here. I'll start the meeting order. Sorry, go ahead.
Go
You
ahead.
want to go, Rami?
No, go ahead,
Okay, well,
Stefan.
Okay, good. Well, I do believe that industry has a major role to play in standing up a structured and properly managed open banking system. Uh, I believe as an industry, it is our responsibility to take voluntary action to enable policy, obviously in partnership with government and fintechs through a public-private yet industry-led approach. Uh, just given our natural expertise in a number of areas here, we do have what it takes to lead the development of a solution for open banking. But of course, once again, this has to be done in the spirit of partnership with all ecosystem participants. So yes, I totally agree with the statements of Minister Morneau.
I think
Rami,
the
did
one
you want to jump in on
perspective,
that one too?
Jennifer.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Rami. No, I think the one perspective I would like to bring is I think it's not important whether it's regulated or unregulated. I think what's important is there is a degree of standardization. So there is a level playing field in the way that different banks open up their APIs and make it available to different fintechs. I think if that's not the case, then you would see some fragmented experience and you will see lack of trust in the open banking infrastructure as well.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
I would also say too, just as a comment on certainly, obviously I act for industry, so I'm coming at it with that focus. I do see a role for government to play. I certainly get concerned though with an over-regulated approach that's not principles based. We see a lot of regulation that is playing catch up, that thinks it's not being prescriptive and that it is, and you end up trying to fit into certain boxes. So I think it's really important for this type of initiative that's going to move so quickly from a technological perspective to stay principles based. And this was sort of brought home to me as a client had asked me a question and I had to look at the code of conduct for the debit and credit card industry. And I'm looking at the definition of a payment applet. And I'm just like, wow, we need to move beyond those sorts of frameworks where we have these defined terms that quickly never even gain meaning really in ordinary usage. So that would be my sort of 2 cents on the government and industry partnership. On the other hand, industry, of course, will have its own concerns that are market driven, and we need government to maybe rein that in if we want to create something that is Canada based. So I think ultimately I do agree with that statement that there's a role for each to play.
Yeah,
Great, thank you. Maybe I'll
glad
jump
to
to the
have.
next question and talk a little bit about. Oh, sorry, Rami, go ahead.
I was going to say, I am glad to have seen I would say, a discernible shift in the dialogue and in the narrative as an industry collectively that we've had over the past year, which has not pitted these conversations at polar extremes. I would say, Mac, when you and I were on the panel last year around this, very much there were incredible polar extremes on these topics. And, I think you've heard me multiple times say, if we can really find a very Canadian way of lowering the rhetoric, reducing the rhetoric in the ecosystem, and crafting out practical pathways to move this forward. Albeit screen scraping has been near term vilified. I don't prescribe to think that it is such the villain, but it is definitely a practice we need to evolve past as an industry, as all of Canadians. We really should be moving Canadians to safer methods of really activating data sets that they generate, that we are collectively stewards of. We play a stewardship role collectively across industry and government, and I think there is a practical path forward. So I'm quite glad that the narrative and the dialogue has shifted to a much more practical conversation around the different enablement roles that exist in the sector. Every party brings a set of tools to the party, if you will. You don't build a house only with hammers and only with screwdrivers. You need all the tools of the toolkit, and we do need that leaning in. So quite glad that the rhetoric is moving to a much more practical state.
Yeah, absolutely. Sab, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. And, we've talked about some of these implementation issues already, standardization, data protection, liability, all of these issues. Can you speak a little bit about where do you think we should be prioritizing first? What's the key areas of focus you think, or the order there?
Yeah, for sure, Jennifer. Thank you, and thank you for moderating this group. As you can tell, there's a lot of passion and a lot of good opinions. So I had nothing to add to the prior, but so first of all, I think treating it as necessarily issues. I would maybe call it scope elements, and I think they're all necessary for a well-functioning open banking ecosystem. But on the question of prioritization, I'm not sure that they have equal weight, and I look at it in two ways. You can look at it as are there any must-haves that should be in place absolutely before there is true secure data exchange happening via APIs, because that's my definition of open banking? Or can you move and prioritize some things where there is, let's say, some low-hanging fruit, things where there's already some consensus on and you can build on? So I'll group data protection and accreditation somewhat together in my mind, because I feel like they're kind of getting at the same goal, which is related to protecting Canadians and their data, and some of their rights associated with data and expectations associated with data, whether it is, how do you need to treat that data, or how do you kind of gate and monitor and manage entities that have access to it? And to me, I would say that's really, priority number one. We shouldn't do anything that compromises Canadians' data and puts it in a more vulnerable situation. So I think that's important. When it comes to the accreditation, I don't think that that's a one size fits all. It is important and it is necessary. A framework is necessary. But I think we got to look at that in terms of, what data is being accessed, what is being used for, and tailor it appropriately. So I think from a prioritization, that's really important. But this data protection and having some consistency there is really key. The other angle to look at it is there consensus somewhere? And I do, I've heard kind of fairly consistently throughout my travels, everyone generally agrees with the principle that liability moves with the data. Okay, what does that actually mean? How's that actually going to be treated? Are there questions around insurance? Those are all still being addressed, but I think there's generally consensus there. I also believe that the question of reciprocity isn't so, contentious here as it is in other markets. In the UK, they didn't start with reciprocity, and that led to a number of challenges in terms of adoption and consistencies, and which ended up impacting consumers. So, kind of a roundabout way to maybe to answer your question, Jennifer, but I think prioritization has to start with some things that are, really key and critical. And again, in that mind, that's anything that can put the Canadian consumer at risk. Others start to get into more efficiency issues. And so I don't think they all need to be in place to kind of answer the last bit of your question before an official open banking framework has come about. And to Liz's point earlier, I think it's going to be a mix, and that's the right way to approach it. I don't think a top-down approach is going to help us succeed in Canada. And so to be able to take a bit of an MVP approach to some of these things, really think them through thoughtfully, but also to move. We got to put something real out there and actually have something practical that is in production for folks to be comfortable that it is working. So that's kind of how I look at it.
Thanks. Maybe that leads me well to the next question we have here for Stefan. You want to comment, Stefan, a bit on that that balance between moving forward before all the rules and standards have been finalized and not being not just standing still while you wait for that to happen.
hmm Well, it goes back a bit to the question you asked earlier as to, what role should industry take on as we move forward. And, in the spirit of, leading public-private industry-led approach, yes, I do believe that we have that role to move the subject forward, to also lead the thought process on a number of areas such as accreditation and liability and common rules and so on and so forth. And the result of these discussions and these reflections will lay the groundwork for this system. And also, given the very aggressive timeline, given the expectations that have been set forward this summer within the report, we do have to, get to work ASAP. Because if we, put ourselves collectively on standby and wait for, the government to name the open banking lead and so on and so forth, we will never hit that early 2023 deadline, to stand up a first version of an open banking system. So yes, definitely. We have to get to work. We have to put our heads together and start, hammering out these concepts. Some of them, which are going to be quite complex to nail down. Common rules. Going back to those two main ones, in my view. Common rules, and with the whole notion of liability and accreditation. Who gets to play within the system? That's going to be a difficult question to answer. So, but yeah, so the time is now. Start moving into action mode.
Saba, did you want to comment on that one too? That tension between the standards and the regulation?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with Stefan wholeheartedly. I think that at the end of the day, no matter which side you're at, the regulations or the perspective from the government is about timing, right? Like they're trying to put a pretty aggressive timeline out there if you think of that 18-month window. And I think industry itself is also saying the same thing. We're all tired of talking about it. We're kind of all tired about being on the open banking circuit, the talk show, if you will, and just having conversations. We want something live, and I think that's what is necessary within Canada. But I think we are unique. We have shown time and again, and I think Rami alluded to this, that industry can move together and done appropriately can move large files forward. So let's maybe look at it from the perspective of the regulatory pressure is helpful, but I don't think any of us are waiting for that to come down, and nor is it going to be, Elizabeth alluded to this, so prescriptive that it's going to be a blueprint that we can all use. It's going to be likely principles based, and that's the best way to approach it.
Thanks, Saba. Rami or Mayank, would you like to jump in on that one too?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll add to it. And Saba, you nailed it. You put that one to a fine point. I guess I leaned into this in a try to be in a practical perspective on it. At the end of the day, we will have. I think we're all clear on policy objectives, and we're all clear on the elements we're trying to accomplish on behalf of Canada and on behalf of Canadians. I believe there's fairly strong consensus, and I would even go as far as saying there's unanimity on the policy objectives. So now the question is the gradations and the gradations around implementation. And for me, as long as we can actually agree on the true north of sort of the standards or the positions that we will not collectively compromise on behalf of Canada and Canadians. We are not going to introduce sectorial wide risk. We are not going to collectively open the system to systemic level risk. We are going to do what's right by Canadians and really do protect privacy and to protect the components that are very precious to them that cannot be reset at a later point in time, such as personally identifiable information that is core to their everyday. That leaves a lot of room to really land an implementation plan of how. And I always lean into all implementations are imperfect by their nature. I think the important part is getting started. To Stefan's point, Stefan, I think you nailed it there. Get the wheel going, and we will find our way through this. We have found many times that we've been successful at it, but there is one formulation that has worked in Canada year in, year out, and to depart from it doesn't seem to be a wise approach, which is industry is a key to implementation. They have decades and decades of expertise and experience in terms of getting outcomes into the hands of the consumer.
I would agree with Rami and Sabah. I think those are fantastic points. I just maybe a slightly different perspective coming into this problem. I think there has to be some sort of hybrid model. I mean, if you look at, even if there is no regulation, if there are, a standard utility that can take care of like consent management and digital identity across the country, then that could become a fast catalyst for people to participate. At the end of the day, I think if you really look at why Uber is successful in its business model, is because it's got the right number of drivers in place, right? Because there are so many cars, passengers come in, and when they look for cars, people are able to use the cars, right? And I think same thing needs to happen for open banking. We need to have enough banks motivated in the play, providing the services so that more customers can come in.
I think I'm going to throw in one of the questions from the audience because I think it's timely right now. It's around industry led, and is there a risk that that will lead to establishing a standard API for all market participants? Does anyone want to jump in on that audience question?
I would say, is it okay if I take it?
Absolutely.
So Jennifer, I would say actually it's quite the contrary, right? Because if there is a little bit of guideline around standardized APIs, and I think if there are guardrails that are set at the industry level, then you would get over the hoops of, hey, I want to share my API information with XYZ bank, but I don't want to do it with some other bank who could be a competition for me, right? So I think then there is a true case of customer being the king in this case, and requesting for data regardless of the port of call of usage. So my perspective is, again, as I said, hybrid model. There should be some sort of guardrails. Otherwise, this would be an organic growth, and I'm pretty sure we all are committed towards it. But it's going to be organic, slow-paced growth. But if there are some catalysts that could drive this, I think we could see some energy into the system. If that makes sense.
So the way I look
also-
at it, the way I'd look at it as I think as an industry, I would frame it in we need accelerants. We need things, to the point you raised, Manak, is it's at the end of the day, if every person approaches it or every institution approaches it with their unique flavor, we all collectively know we will have significant amount of technical debt in a couple of years to unravel. And at the end of the day, this will cost organizations collective funds. And we do have to look at it from the lens of smaller entrants and the non-incumbents who will want to see some level of stability in the investments they're making. We do have to juxtapose that and balance that within variations and flavors. And I always, I guess, probably over-index slightly to the consumer demand. What are Canadians asking for? What are they asking us to deliver collectively as a sector and as an industry? And that should probably influence it. But there's always going to be a need for an accelerant, something that starts it. And common standards do help that cause. And even common starting Lego blocks technically do help that. And, you said it right. There are certain things that are much more practically activated in a central model, call it a utility, call it whatever you want to call it. There are certain things that are not really competitive in nature, and we all benefit from it. There's a reason, not there's a reason we have hospitals and not, every 20 individuals decides to build their own hospital. There are some common goods that do come out of public and private leaning in.
Yeah, I think that
Thanks, Andrew.
commonality is really key. It doesn't, if we just think of very simple things like the size of a credit card, we wouldn't have the payment system that we have today if we hadn't all agreed that it was a certain size and it worked a certain way. And I think open banking is very similar in that respect.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to go to you, Matt, because the audience is asking this question, and we actually had it on our list too. Obviously, there's other jurisdictions that have done this already in the UK and Australia. So, wanted to get your views on what can we learn from those implementations.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and the short answer is lots. At the end of the day, so we were tasked with our standards policy committee here at the council approved this work of a series of national standards around open banking. Right around this time last year, I think it was probably a month ahead, right before Christmas, it was approved, which then tasked my group down to actually execute this. So, which was funny about open banking that I noticed, being a new by all accounts to it, was that typically when we undergo these projects, it's a very binary approach. Where do you start, right? You start at the fundamentals, or you start at the beginning of the story. Noting that our mandate is to work in tandem with the technical standards from FDX and the like, and have a more governance approach to it. We had a very difficult time with our conversations deciding, where the stakeholders wanted to start, at what level. So this led to me with a lot of questions with Open Banking UK and the CDR in Australia, and they were very patient with me. So I would like to thank them for that. If anybody's on the call from there, and where it really led to us was that there's kind of pros and cons, with having legislation support these types of projects. To I think Elizabeth's point earlier, if you have this policy, you're kind of stuck with these terms that are made up by policymakers that may not really have relevance or used outside of that space. So that was an opportunity we saw. But then in terms of where to start, the one thing we could get everybody to agree on was with the consumer experience. So that's where the process kind of started with there, and then leveraging, the work started in the UK, and then 2.0 or 1.0 in Australia, and then see the working that Brazil is doing. And it's funny because now these groups are very, very interested in what Canada is going to be, because they just see us, building that next phase of development and learning from where they're going. The key to this is really getting to the point where we're not being prescriptive at all, right? And to maintain that level of being technologically agnostic, right? These standards are for all Canadians and all stakeholders, so they have to be accessible for everybody to use. So I would say that would be the lesson learned. While the pros would be of having legislation to be moving the needle forward by being able to engage all the stakeholders and kind of get them all in the same virtual room, if you will, to have these conversations. You really are getting, and then building iteratively off that, you're really getting the full picture and where you're going. And then much to Saba's point around scope, right? That's where you start identifying issues of scope, and that's how ultimately the series grows, right? So, so that, I think that's about it. Starting with the terms, starting at a point where everybody can agree is the most important, and then kind of building iteratively, making sure that everybody's voice is heard, and having these documents work for everybody is really just the key goals. So.
I'd love to get others to jump in on this one too. Anyone else want to comment on what you think we should take from other jurisdictions? Or things we shouldn't do?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in on this one, considering I've spent quite a bit of time with my colleagues in other geographies and supported some of our UK efforts. I would say a couple of things. I think we have a lot to understand and gain in terms of I would say, implementation tactics that became cross-sectoral. How do you do this at scale? I think that's one benefit. One geography, I think we always often look to the UK and Australia for inspiration. It's very Canadian of us. It's we always look to the Commonwealth countries, and we kind of follow it, whether it's payments or data or other elements. I get excited by the work that Singapore's done. There's some incredibly strong patterns coming out of Singapore that actually activate a very successful public-private collaboration. It's very typically Singaporean, and I look at that geography for certain areas about how they also stepped into this gradually, thoughtfully, but also kept the promise of adding elements of scope as time progressed and as the proof points emerged. I would say things to be wary of. Let's not treat privacy and security as afterthoughts and bolt-ons. When that became definitely the case in some of the other geographies, it actually impacted the experience for the new entrants, much more so than the incumbents, and it became a bottleneck in the entire system. And finally, I would say it's how we engage. It's no secret that some of the conversations, especially in the UK, became very frictionful. Incredibly frictionful, and I think that delayed the outcomes and the cause and left an indelible mark on the sector for many years to come. And I think we do have an opportunity to carve out a different path that isn't as frictionful.
Thanks, Rami. Mayank, would you like to jump in on this one too? Oh, we can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I agree with everything that was said. I have nothing to add. I think those were really comprehensive comments.
Well, maybe I'll go to you next, Mayank, on the question around opportunities and challenges of the path that the US is taking versus Canada right now.
I think Rami said it earlier. The challenge that I see is with the different implementation models. I see there is a risk of technical debt that gets created, which becomes prohibitive over a course of time. So I see that as one big challenge. From consumers' perspective, the other big challenge I see is that when a client moves from one bank to another, the implementation or making it real, making it available might be another challenge. Um, the opportunity clearly are like right in the sweet spot. I think the unfortunately in this case the banks could decide who they want to share the data with, which TPP, etc. Um, which you could look at it from both perspective, whether it's an opportunity or whether it's a wrong way of looking at things, right? Um, my view is that if there is certain amount of standardization. Sorry, I said this earlier. Apologies for being repetitive. And then there is certain amount of industry accelerators or catalysts. Things like consent management. I think the Canadian model it would be great with those two served, and I think it would be a level playing field where the consumer would win.
Thanks, Mayank. Saba, did you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, happy to. So it's a good question. I think Mike really touched on it, but I think some of the differences in the models, also you have to look at it based on just US and Canada are just different, right? Our banking systems are different. The regulatory environments, especially when you look at privacy laws and competition laws, those are different. So I feel like a lot of what's going to happen in terms of the models are going to be driven by considerations such as that. And the other one is related to just number of financial institutions and scale and where customer accounts are perhaps concentrated, as well as the fintech ecosystem. So I think differences are natural, and that's why I'm sure you've heard from a lot of the panelists, and a consistent theme is it is possible to do a made in Canada approach. It is possible to take things a little bit differently. It's why a hybrid model is feasible that has the appropriate amount of regulatory oversight and insight and policies, if you will, as well as industry actually moving something forward. And I'm not sure that that's 100% feasible in the US, just given how fractured some of that ecosystem is.
Yeah, the sheer number of banks in the US compared to the number of banks in Canada, which are listed on a handy schedule in the Bank Act, it's just a huge difference. So I really think that the model and our approach will be quite different from the US. It probably will be, a little closer to the UK and Australia side, but without, I think, the same level of government intervention, at least not that I'm seeing at this point.
So, Mike, I'm going to jump to a question from the audience here that came in. It's really specific to Citi, and I think you're prepared to answer this one. But it's really about the experience for Citi's open banking, just in your onboarding process relative to other internet or onboarding channels. So I'll leave it to you to answer that one. It's a fairly specific question.
Yeah, no, and thanks for the question, whoever asked. I think it's a very, very good question. It fundamentally boils down to creating the right solution for right type of persona, right? So our internet banking, mobile banking, etc., are geared for people who are for the finance users who are sitting in shared service centers or accounts payable, etc., trying to look at the balances and do something with the supply chain. So they have a different need for experience. Whereas when we look at our open banking, consumers on the client side, essentially when it comes to onboarding, these are API, these are technical people, they have a different expectation for experience. And the often mistake that people make is they think that it's a common experience you can deploy generic experience across functional and technical users, which I think is, after talking to many clients, we realize that that probably is not the right way of looking at things, but doing something custom for a technical user, because the needs are very, very different. But once the user is onboarded, the information about, the balances across different banks, etc., they're all centralized on the functional user platform, internet banking, mobile banking, etc. So it's just the onboarding and setup and usability of APIs. We have kept it separate because clearly the persona and the needs are very different for technical users.
Thanks, Mike. There's another one here from the audience that I'll throw out to our panelists, and it's really about timing. People are wondering about, well, what do you think in terms of getting the system up and running? Obviously, there's been a deadline set for 2023, but I'd be curious to see what people's perspectives are on that, positive, negative. I'll throw it out. Does anyone want to start us off on that one?
Okay, I'll grab it.
Okay,
go ahead. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I was just going to say that in terms of timing, that 2023 deadline was set, but I think we're already late in terms of the timeline that was set there. If we were going purely on a government driven model, the report I think was supposed to be issued in April, but it only came out in August, and there's a lot of steps that need to happen, frankly, by next month. And so maybe those things are happening, and I don't know about them, but I haven't sort of seen anything come through at this point. And there's quite a lot that needed to be done in those first 9 months. But in terms of industry initiatives, like I was alluding to before, we are seeing the movement. Like here we are on this panel, we've got lots of participants from industry who are clearly forging ahead on a variety of things for their organizations. So 2023, I certainly would throw it back, to the industry participants here on the panel, because I think if it's going to happen in 2023, it's going to be industry that makes that happen with some sort of MVP or a start. What that specifically looks like, I think, is still up for grabs. But that's my thought.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
So
Any others?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So here's the biggest challenge we have right now at this point. The report made some very, very bold statements right now. And anyone who has ever been in digital delivery knows that there's a very, very simple equation here. You have scope on one hand, and you have the delivery date on the other. And what we're seeing right now in the ask of the report, it doesn't balance. It doesn't balance. The initial scope is too broad, and the clock is ticking. So I don't want to jump into the discussion on scope here, although we can on a later question here. But right now, it just doesn't add up. Right now, there's too much scope and too little time. So we definitely need, as an ecosystem, to come together and agree on what will be the scope for this initial MVP. Once we get that one nailed down, I think we can definitely stand something up for 2023. But the current ask, I just don't see it happening, unfortunately.
Thanks, Stefan.
So
Ravi, would you
I'll
like
add
to
to
jump in?
Stefan. Yeah, I'll add to Stefan's point. I think there's another variable which is how and the desirability of
Mhm.
all players in the sector about being engaged throughout the process. So it becomes an exponential challenge, width of problem, compressed time dimension, number of players becomes an incredibly exponential challenge in terms of doing the what, the when, and the how at the same time. I would also say, I think you started out by saying the deadline. The date was recommended by the advisory committee. The advisory committee report is a recommendation to policymakers, and we do still have to converge on the elements of the report that are the sweet spot for Canada and for the Canadian sector. And there are some things in the report that I would say would need further dialogue with the likes of OSFI and Fintech and areas where the report has strayed beyond, I would say, original envisioned statements around what this system is meant to address. So there are, I would say, some elements of true up required. Now, that does not juxtapose industry momentum. So I don't want that to be taken away as that, momentum is not desired or momentum is not key. We do have to establish pace. We are all collectively establishing pace. There are various industry dialogues underway. And I think that's, I would basically stress the importance of continuing with that momentum on an ongoing basis. And I don't believe anybody's really sort of waiting for the next shoe to drop. I think there is just a reality to the implementation of, nationwide type systems that cover Canadians from coast to coast, border to the Arctic Circle and beyond, at scale, safely and securely. And I think those are going to also be implementation realities. So I guess to put a fine point on it, report meets implementation reality. There's going to have to be a true up somewhere in between those.
No doubt. And that leads me really well to our last question. We're almost at the end of time here, but I always like to end with a bit of some bold predictions for those who are willing to put some forward. Where are we going to be 1 year? Where are we going to be 5 years from now? Elizabeth, can I start with you on that one? Are you ready to provide some kind of bold prediction for us?
I know, although I don't know why the lawyer has to start out with the bold prediction. So we're looking on we're focusing on risk and all these other things. But maybe to step back, put on a little bit of my consumer hat on with the legal flavor, and speaking from the legal and regulatory perspective, I think on that front, I do see developments on privacy happening. I think that dialogue is still continuing on the legislative front. And if we do get legislative reform that includes things like data mobility rights, that will help the catalyst. We've talked a lot on this panel about the catalyst, and so far the catalyst is industry. That's what we're hearing from this panel. If we wanted a legislative catalyst, I think that something like legislative data mobility rights could be that from that perspective. But it's still going to be something that is going to be slow. And I talked about this before. I think that there's just always a little bit of catch up on the legal framework. And, in fairness to our regulators, there's been a lot going on in the past couple of years. And their focus has been elsewhere than on things like open banking as, emergency measures kind of turn into day-to-day business as usual from a regulatory stand front, which we are seeing. There may be renewed focus on some of these initiatives. So the bold prediction, legal and regulatory landscape in a year, I don't think much will have changed. 5 years out, we will see reactions. There will certainly be progress because of the catalyst that we've talked about here on the industry side of things.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I appreciate it. I think we've got time for one more quick one. Maybe Saba, do you want to jump in?
How about not a prediction, but a wish? A wish is that 5 years from now, we're not just talking about open banking. We're talking about open data and we're addressing friction in other industries beyond what we're discussing here, because this isn't just about that. So that's my wish, not a prediction, and let's see if we can make it happen.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate everyone's time here today and you're sharing your perspectives with the group. Thank you to Open Banking Expo for hosting the discussion. It's been a delight to join all of you today. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.